Well, if we're talking about information management, and let me see if I can get these slides clicking. Okay, something's happening or not. Okay, yeah, information architecture is a discipline that helps people understand their work field, their relationships with the real world, as they are stored and depicted in information systems, which are, of course, supposed to reflect the real world. So it deals with objects, their relationships, their hierarchies, their categories, to store and retrieve them in and from applications, files, websites, and social media. And I deliberately mention websites and social media because the expanding field of big and unstructured data is adding complexity to information architecture. Talk a little bit more about what we call shifting paradigms. I know in information technology it's almost used every day, and it's most of the time old wine in new bags, but I can guarantee you there is a paradigm shift going on in information architecture. We also talk a little bit about the technology enablers and finish off with a practical case which is quite simple, but I can talk to you about lots of, let's say, more complex cases if you like, but that's for the Q&A, of course. Look at analytics and information architecture and architecture development. You have what I call the classic chain of events. You pose a business question, you start looking for the data, which can be a messy part of it. In most data science projects I worked on, 80% of the effort was just looking for the data and making sure the data was clean and usable. And I'm not just talking about transformations to make it ready for statistical analysis. I'm just talking about getting the data and preparing the data for accessible format in some cases. And then, of course, you gather the data, you manipulate them, you visualize them, and please don't use pie charts all the time. Start with a histogram, start with looking what the distribution of the different variables is, and make sure it's understandable for the business. And then, of course, you analyze the data, you interpret the data, and you integrate it in a decision-making process, preferably, because that's also another disappointing figure. About 60–70% of analytics is not used in decision-making. Taking the other classical chain of events, this is the well-known TOGAF architecture development method. And at the heart of this enterprise architecture development is the management of requirements. Of course, is the rub, as Shakespeare would say, because these requirements are predominantly based on process support. You have to support user stories like, as a call center agent, I want to see the entire client history when the call comes in order to serve the customer better. That's a typical process requirement. So this process requirement, making the data, let's say, subordinate to the process. So it's within the context of the process that the data is treated. And even in this case, it's a comprehensive example. But of course, there are more microscopic views on data and user stories. So the trouble already begins there. If your requirements management only focuses on this, then you don't have a complete picture of all the data you will need in other levels and in other processes. So yes, we have a shifting paradigm. If ever you have the time to read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, you will get a deeper insight in what a paradigm shift is. But let's stay on a higher level now and talk about the critical anomalies, which normally signal that there's something going on and that the existing set of rules and the existing set of concepts is not working anymore to deal with reality. So what you get is, if you have a top-down look on this thing, you get inconsistent decision-making based on inconsistent information, and itself, of course, based on inconsistent data. And for those who are not sure what the difference between information and data is, data in context, actionable data, that is information, of course. Now, this is coming to a critical level, especially when you are in e-business, for instance, because time to market is often equal there to the time it takes to tailor data to your needs. think, for instance, of recommenders in e-business or cross-selling in retail. So the time to market can be under severe pressure by competition if they manage their data better than you. And then, of course, there's also an external pressure, which is the GDPR. I'll talk a little bit more later about GDPR. It's the General Data Protection Regulation imposed by the European Union. And don't think that foreign companies won't be subjected to this law, because everybody who does business in the EU or reaches or deals with personal data from people from the EU is subjected to this regulation. So you need valid and explicit consent for use of data that can identify a person. You need to do data protection by default. So anonymize or pseudonymize personal data. You need to communicate whenever there is a data breach and inform the people who are the victim of this data breach. And even more important, you need records of processing activities. So, but we'll talk a little bit more on this later on. Now, if you look at the critical anomalies, we'll later on talk also about, of course, the technology enablers. And, of course, this is the essence of the thing. We need fluid processes and consistent data. So in the old days, you automated processes, and that was that. The data was something like, an end product of the process, but not very important. Now we are turning this thing around and say we need consistent data, and the processes need to change overnight if necessary. So yeah, these are the critical anomalies. And by the way, this is a good example and a good way to get acquainted with Archimate, which is an enterprise information modeling language developed in the Netherlands, but it's open source. You can download, for instance, Archi, A-R-C-H-I, to model your data, your processes, your applications, and your network. So it works on the 4 levels, as in any enterprise architecture tool. It's open source, so you can, with Spark Enterprise Architect. Mega is also a tool that uses it. So I guess it's interesting to look, for instance, here at the generic concepts I used to illustrate what I mean with the old paradigm. Stakeholders have business goals, and of course these goals are influenced by external drivers, and this of course influences requirements. And normally these requirements, since they deal with processes, what you get is distinct parts of the business process that are supported by an application, which use some data, and of course which sometimes alter data, and then pass these data on to another application, which has another perspective on the data and also alters these data, etc., etc. So this is the story of how data is closely linked to processes, but not entirely to decision making. If you go then to decision support, as it is in 80% of the cases today, you have these 2 separate worlds where you have the business drivers for business processes support by transaction system, generating transactional data objects. And then, of course, with a latency of a day +1, you have your decisional drivers extracting data from the transaction system to support the decision-making process, and you get your decisional data object. And these 2 live in separate worlds and in separate systems. Now, other than that is, of course, transactional decision support, but it's still, this is often called, by the way, trickle-through or near real-time analysis systems, but the fundamental drivers are still separated. It's still, on the higher level, the business process, which leads to a scoring model, which makes sure that applications collaborate with each other, but it's still based on a separate business driver. So it's okay, but it's not yet perfect. Now, we did the exercise 2 years ago for financial trading platform, and what we did was we developed the party model at the heart of all processes and all analytics. It's not yet